Welcome to the DEEPMED Seminar, a history forum for ocean science, strategy, and the environment. The DEEPMED Seminar is brought to you by European Research Council-funded research project, DEEPMED, which stands for Discovering the Deep Mediterranean Environment, a history of science and strategy from 1860 to the present. Today, Sam Robinson will be offering a very intriguing talk called Paper Empire, Hydrography and the Composition of British South Atlantic Oceanic Imperialism between 1923 and 1939. I made a mistake and listed Sam as a researcher at Southampton. He's actually at York. He used to be at Southampton before. Now he's at the University of York. By the way, our last speaker, Katie Anderson, is also at the University of York, but she's at the Canadian York, and Sam is at the English York. He is the author of Ocean Science and the British Cold War State, a book that I highly recommend because it uses ocean science to understand the British Cold War state. It's not just a history of oceanography. And he's the author of a number of very good papers, some of them on ocean diplomacy, the role of oceans in international relations. I'm very proud to say that we co-authored two of those papers, one in historical studies in the natural sciences on the Strait of Gibraltar, and another one on the same issue for a post in a blog in the Guardian. And we also presented that paper on Gibraltar on a couple of conferences. In one of them, we kind of did a role play, in which he represented, Great Britain, the British take on Gibraltar, and I represented the Spanish take on Gibraltar, and it was fun to do. And he has published some papers on, for instance, the International Commission for the Exploration of the Seas in the early 20th century, and the law of the sea in later periods of the 1980s. Bless you.
Sorry.
Okay, so without further ado, Sam, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lino. So this paper is based on research that I undertook last summer and at Southampton, and it's basically almost a prequel book to my existing book. So this is the 1920s and the 1930s. It feeds beautifully on from Katie's presentation last time, from Katie Anderson's paper, as you will see. But I realized when I put this together that this title was supposed to be interesting and attractive, but really the book title is probably more understandable. So if my slides work, which they don't, this is I'm basically going to give a book talk, which is what you got last time. There's lots of pretty pictures, and there's some vague concepts going around. This is work that we're still undertaking. So the book is called Discovery Investigation, Science and the Making of the British South Atlantic Empire. And it works very much to do what Katie talked about last time when she showed you that definition from 1923. And I'm not showing you the slide because if you've not watched Katie's talk, you should go back and watch Katie's talk. Where the modern definition of oceanography in terms of its scientific content is there, and then there's this paragraph that says it's about contributions to fisheries, economic processes, exploitation of the oceans, etc., etc., etc. This story that we're telling in this book is very much about that fuller 1920s definition of ocean science. Although, as I'll explain later on, the same vessels involved in this become involved in that more modern, narrower definition of kind of pure science. So I'm writing this book with a colleague called Daniela McCahey, who's at Texas Tech University. But in this talk, anything you have a problem with is my fault, not Daniela's. But there you go. So I, unlike Katie, don't have a problem with contents. The book basically talks about, we'll start by talking about whaling and sealing in Antarctica up to 1918, which Daniela's writing. There's then an account, which I'm going to give in this paper, of why the British decide to develop a empire basically of ocean, an ocean empire with a couple of very small islands in it, and why they thought that science was the way of cementing their sovereignty, I guess, of this empire. There's two chapters I'm not going to talk about too much today, but these are direct quotes from the beautifully rich source material we have. So as one of the scientists referred to researching Antarctica in the 1920s on ships that are very basic, with very basic equipment, Antarctica in the 1920s is a bastard of a place. It's not somewhere you go willingly. And a lot of these, and you know, we're going to do a second chapter that talks specifically about the lives of these scientists and the crews. The nice thing about the huge amount of documentation that we have that no one's ever looked at, and we're talking here upwards of 2,500 folders of files at Southampton, all of which are about this thick. More records at the National Archives in London, records at the Natural History Museum in London, records in Edinburgh University, records at the National Museum of Edinburgh of Scotland, which is also in Edinburgh, at the National Library. Like, the archives are just extensive and just keep coming up in new places. So we have a full crew list. We know every single name of every cabin boy who ever went on one of these voyages, all the way up to the captains and the scientists, which is unusual for oceanography to know everybody. What I'm going to talk about a little bit today is the science that they did, which is chapter 5, and also in chapter 6, how they used their activities in the Southern Ocean and the promotion and the media around that, the kind of public accounts of them being there as a way of justifying British ownership of this space, which was extremely liminal because it is water, and it's difficult even today to think of suggesting that you own what was effectively 2 million square miles of ocean and no one else has any claim to it. This chapter 7, the investigation basically was always a challenge within the British Empire. The people who were responsible for developing the Falkland Islands, which I'll explain where that is in a minute, always felt that this was a waste of money, that money could be spent on physical things rather than science, which I think has always been a problem for science. And finally, why all of this really matters in chapter 8 is for two reasons. If you wanted to understand whales today, the animals, and you wanted to do research on them, it's very hard to get to take a whale today for science. What you are likely to be pointed towards is the huge collection of specimens that this project over about 20 years collected, which sit at the Natural History Museum in London, or you're going to be sent to the 37 volumes of reports that they published, and they constitute the biggest body of research on whales, which was what was intended. Sadly, they actually also document the destruction of an entire marine mammal population. But the British also used this whole scientific episode to justify in the International Criminal Court in 1955 British territorial claims to Antarctica against Chilean and Argentinian challenges. The British didn't ultimately win. We know that Antarctica was split under an Antarctic treaty amongst countries that had taken part in the IGY, and the very limited number of countries who in the late 1950s could actually do research in Antarctica, and Antarctica was handed over to a continent for science, etc., etc., etc. However, the islands that were mostly studied as part of this project remained British territory, and so to get onto South Georgia, which I'm going to come on to explain where that is in a minute, you do it through the British Antarctic Survey. You don't do it through an appeal to the Antarctic Treaty directly. Okay, but you can ask me more about modern Antarctica in the questions. I think it's important that we stick with the history. So there have been, it's always good to show you some literature. There have been some histories that have kind of touched on this. Anyone who's engaged with the archive in Southampton has tended to be intimidated and left and run away, taking a small amount, because there's a huge amount when you realize it. But there's been a history of the whaling industry by Ian Hart, which is the book in the top left, Whaling in the Falkland Island Dependencies. Klaus Dodds, in a book called Pink Ice, has talked a little bit about these claims of sovereignty that the British have made over many years to a southern sort of Atlantic empire, as he calls it. But as I'll show you in a minute, it's more than just the Atlantic. Graham Burnett, in a absolutely massive of a book, you could say a whale of a book, which is a joke that's been made before, wrote probably the longest history of whaling you're ever going to see. It's about 700 plus pages long. It's worth a read. There's about 100-page chapter on the discovery investigations, but it tends to be quite superficial. It tends to be written from the published materials. It does not in any way really get into the archives in the way that me and Daniela have done. And also, I know you've had him speak in the series. Peter Roberts, in his first book, has a chapter about the discovery investigations. But again, Peter didn't go into the full detail of every aspect. We intend to do a full history. There's also been histories more recently of, I realize I haven't put any dates on, but just trust me, these are from the last 10 years or so. There's been more histories of Antarctica. So we've had Alessandro Antonelli's great book on called The Greening of Antarctica, which is about environmental protection regimes in Antarctica. Helen Rozwadowski produced an edited volume with ECO, and I know you've had Helen, about oceanography and polar science and the interrelations, which I'm sure you've had a look at by now. Joy McCann wrote Wild Sea, a history of the Southern Ocean, a few years ago, which is basically everything about human interaction and human imagination of what the Southern Ocean would be. It's kind of a different approach, more of a cultural studies approach to what we're trying to do. And then Adrian Hawkins has written about this imperialistic kind of ambition in the in Antarctic spaces, if Antarctica is some kind of wild and empty frontier that European colonialism could go into. We are building on all of those to write a solid history of this one British kind of case, but as you'll see, dominates the entire story that you might want to tell about southern latitudes 50 degrees south and lower from about 1920 onwards. But our story starts in the north, so not to confuse you, I'm going to go back to the Arctic. Around the early 20th century and since the 16th century, an island, I don't know whether you can you see my cursor at all? No? Yes? Okay, so we could talk about this little bit here. This is Spitsbergen or Svalbard. This is a sort of island territory. This is an early map of it, discovered by the Dutch in 1608-ish. They started whaling. Oh no, wrong picture. They started whaling up there and developing it, and around the turn of the 20th century, as the whaling industry up there was dying out, they discovered coal, and Spitsbergen became the potential space, as you can see, to connect if there was going to be a northeast passage to China, which is what the Dutch had been looking for in the early 1600s, or a northwest passage to across the top of Canada. Spitsbergen will be an important jumping off place. And at the point when coal was discovered, everyone basically scrambled for it. The Americans, the Canadians, the British, the Norwegians, the Swedes, and the Russians, and it became a mess. What I'm going to tell you about in the next 10 minutes is the British trying to avoid that, trying to claim that they had sovereignty over the Southern Ocean, so they didn't have to have a geostrategic, geopolitical fight over such a strategically sensitive high latitude space. So Spitsbergen today, just to jump into the present, is a kind of perfectly science fiction-y space. It holds things like this, the global seed vault, that if climate change doesn't get us and we go back to nuclear war, which was a joke I probably could make 5 years ago, but seems a bit more present now, this holds examples of seeds from all plant life across the world, and in theory you could recreate European, that was a slip, you could recreate global biosphere from the seeds held in this vault. But for most time it's been quite a primitive place. So this is the painting of those Dutch whalers. You can see this is a little bit darker on my screen than it was, but these ships have different flags. That's a Dutch ship in front, but the one to the left is Danish. These are whaling with harpoons. It's very primitive, and they have shacks. So Svalbard was possible to use in the summer for a whaling industry. And when whaling was done by men who rowed boats, and it was mostly men, and they killed the whales with harpoons they threw by hand, the whaling industry was largely sustainable. But the whales still declined, especially in the 19th century, when the ships got better, the technology improved, and the ability to capture whales was increased, and the number of the whalers therefore also increased. So by the late 19th century, early 20th century, the whaling industry has largely been died because the whales have been hunted to extinction. In 1898, someone discovers coal on Svalbard. Now, coal is the modern hydrocarbon technology of the 19th, 20th century. It offers a modern revolution for an Arctic space. So these are just pictures of the miners. Basically, they create a permanent residence from 1908, which is Longyearbyen, and these mines are still active. The Russians still mine on Svalbard, although they've promised that this year they will finally end this practice. And this opens up Svalbard. So in the 20s and 30s, there's lots of science being undertaken there. This is the Norge airship. We'll come back to that later in the talk. There's hot air balloon missions, but there's still a lot of science done with sleds and dogs. And you can see in the top right with this kind of air-mindedness that Katie was talking about last time, Svalbard, which if I get my cursor back is here, becomes an important node for shortening routes east-west at the Atlantic. And if you've ever flown transatlantic, your flight has largely probably gone all the way up to the Arctic and come back down because it shortens your route. So they're already thinking about the importance of having this territory occupied for radios, potentially for air as an airport. But this is all driven by the fact there's coal there, and that makes permanent residence easier. You can burn coal for heat and light. You can burn coal to run machinery. Final slide on Svalbard before we go south. The Svalbard is still a space for science. The top left is the Russian Institute, which is a little bit run down. On the right is the kind of European Norwegian Research Institute, which is this fantastic piece of modern architectural art. NASA runs space flight monitoring from there, and it's really important for modern meteorology. The southern story is slightly different. So history, finally. So the Falkland Islands had been under British rule since 1833. I would say that they are, much like Gibraltar, contested with Argentina. There was a war in the 1980s, but I'm not going to talk about that at all. The Falkland Islands was important. It had a centre called Stanley. It was a port. You could basically raise sheep on the land. It wasn't covered in snow and ice all year round. There was a lot of beer drank there. These are all beer barrels, by the way, or possibly whiskey barrels, and that's the only pub on the island, the Falkland Islands Company. And in 1908, they extended what they understood, the British understood the Falklands to be this tiny group of islands 200, 300 miles off Argentina, to all the islands in the Southern Ocean, including South Georgia, and islands I'm going to show you in a minute on a map. That was like a creep. And then in 1920s, Leo Amery, who was the Foreign Secretary, said that basically Britain should annex all of Antarctica for its empire. And this is the making of the British Southern Atlantic Empire that Klaus has talked about. We're going to just talk about it in terms of just a Southern Empire, right? A Southern Ocean Empire. So another map from looking now from the south. This is obviously Antarctica. Unlike the Arctic, it's land mostly, not just a floating ice sheet. This is the southern tip of South America in your top left. The Falkland Islands are here. This is the Antarctic Peninsula that sticks out like a tentacle. You have the South Orkney Islands and you have South Georgia. Most of the story focuses on South Georgia because it's the only place that had a port that could be used all year round, and had some kind of habitation. It's an island about 100 miles long. It's not very wide. It's not that hospitable, right? And it's only naturally occurring animals with seals, but most of those have been killed in 2 seasons in the 1820s by Americans who came and took about 200,000 seals in 2 years. and basically marine life. So it's not a very sustainable existence. Geopolitically, this is a really significant area at the time. Falklands is the nearest, I've lost my cursor now, but Falklands, which is here, is the nearest basic safe harbour after Cape Horn, which is here, which is the scene of many shipwrecks. And many ships came into Falklands for repair after being damaged on this dangerous passage. There was a battle fought here in the First World War, the Battle of the Falklands. The Royal Navy has a regular presence, but not a very big presence. And there's always been tensions from the 1830s onwards with Argentina about ownership. And Falklands and South Georgia in particular are the only all seasons, all weather ports in the Antarctic. At the time, there's some more now. And this extends British territorial claim from here, from the Falklands, now to everything you see on that map. And that map, just to be clear, this map is a 1917 school map published in a geography textbook in Britain and sent to every school child, seen by every school child in Britain. So this is now annexed for the empire, all that you see. And on the other side here, you've got Australia, which is part of the Commonwealth of the empire, and New Zealand. So it's all British, just to be clear, and everything that floats in it, as we'll see. The Falkland Island dependencies is a quadrant of that. So I think you can just see it clearly. Falklands here, South Georgia's here, South Orkneys, South Shetlands, which are open in the summer but not in the winter. South Sandwich Islands, there's not a lot there, but it's all of the sea space that you see, right? This is an empire. Empire you think of as being territorial in terms of land. This is thinking, how do we have an empire of the sea? And the answer is we basically do oceanography there. Now, these spaces had been first, the context of why this suddenly matters is not really about military. It's about a burgeoning industry around whaling. So in the 1880s, a Dundee whaling fleet, which had struggled in the North Atlantic and because of declining stocks, goes to Antarctica and finds that the whales are so easy to kill, they literally float by the boats because they've never been hunted before. So the charismatic megafauna, as we call them today, of the Southern Oceans are just so easy to kill. They're the dodos of the sea. And the whaling fleet is massively successful. They also like to take penguins because penguins are new to them. And there's a couple of chaps here, I don't know if you can see in the middle of the shot, about to try and take some penguins, right? I'm not sure where the Grand Canyon of ice is that they're supposed to be here. I've never seen anywhere in Antarctica quite like this, but the fascination with ice continues. There's 26,000 photographs of icebergs in the collections at Southampton, which are uncatalogued. So I went through about 1,000 of them and gave up to trying to find pictures of other things that are more interesting. By 1908, there is an active whaling industry at South Georgia. Not only are the whales easier to catch, they're bigger. So this is a blue whale. You can see there's some men stood in the foreground to give you a scale. No whale of this size had really been caught in the Arctic before. And one of these is worth 3 humpback. It's worth 2 fin whales. So you can kill bigger whales, although these are difficult with harpoons to catch. So the Norwegians develop an exploding harpoon gun, which is why you can see that there's entrails on the ground here, because they do a lot of damage. They literally go into the whale, then explode, and the whale bleeds to death. It's gruesome. Right? Sorry, I should have done trigger warnings. And then the whale landed on these slips. And here becomes the empire thing. At that point, the Norwegians pay a tax to the British government because all the whales in the Southern Ocean are British subjects. So they're due tax. So you pay tax. You then strip your whale down. All of the blubber and fat you render down in that shack behind to oil, which then goes on the ship in the top back corner. And some of the whale bone is useful. And if it's not useful, you just discard it. And no one cares because this is wilderness, right? And these sites are still heavily polluted to today, and cruise ships go there. That's the only way to really go and visit. So this whaling industry attracts an Argentinian company that's backed by British, a British company that's staffed entirely by Norwegians, and Norwegian companies that are given under a system of licenses that say how many ships they can have and how many whales they can take. The reason for this is that the British have determined that this should be a sustainable industry from the outset. And I've talked in my paper, I think the guys in DEEPMED have read about the opening of sustainable fisheries in the North Sea. This is sustainable fisheries in the Antarctic. So very quickly, it becomes apparent that this is not maybe so sustainable. In 1914, there's an attempt in the Colonial Office to consider whether the regulations and the form of governance through licenses is working or not, and the war intervenes. But by 1917, this committee reforms. It calls itself the Interdepartmental Committee on Research and Development Independence of the Falklands, and it gathers, excuse me, first-hand evidence from scientists, explorers, and whalers, and publishes it in this really fat report. It's a couple of 100 pages long, which is enough material for an entire chapter of the book. But the quick bit that I thought I wanted to pick up is this table, which I hope is legible. So in 1910, they take in 5,500 whales. Most of them are humpback whales, 96%, and only 1% are fin or blue whales. By 1914, let's take 1415, they're taking 4,000 whales, but only 15% are humpbacks. Humpbacks have already seen a huge rapid decline from 90% of the catch down to now 15, and they're able to take blue whales because they have those exploding harpoons. During the war, they actually remove restrictions on numbers. So a lot are taken in 15, 16. That's an incomplete set of results, and that's an incomplete set of results. So it was probably about the same number. They're still taking about 5,000 to 6,000 whales, but they're increasingly the bigger species, which means they're producing more oil, right? Because one of these is worth 3 of those. Now, you might say, Sam, what the heck is the whale? Why is the whale a solid commodity in World War I? Well, let me tell you. If you were a soldier sat in a trench in Flanders, you used whale oil or whale grease to line your boots to avoid getting trench foot. But that's not the thing. I mean, that's a good use of whale, right? That saves you from trench foot. You're in trenches, though, because you're trying to avoid the whales that are flying over your head. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, whale oil is one of the key ways in the early 20th century, before there was a synthetic method, which the Germans had during the First World War, but the British didn't, to create glycerine. Glycerine is the core ingredient in cordite and nitroglycerine, 2 of the main forms of explosives used in World War I. So almost all the shells used in World War I by the British have whale product in them. So whales are fundamentally important to British fighting the First World War. And when this report is published in 1920, the British still don't have that synthetic process. And so whales and whale products will be as important in the British mindset of fighting the next war as oil will be. So, I mean, I hope that was a new fact for you, but basically whales make things go bang in the First World War. So they're an important geopolitical, geostrategic resource. So what this report does that's really important is it launches a scientific study of whaling with the aim of developing and conserving the industry so that it will not become a second North Atlantic industry. It raises a tax on the industry that then is given directly to science, which is very unpopular amongst the governor of Falkland, and it suggests that the Colonial Office can purchase ships to carry out the research in the southern waters. What that means is the Discovery Investigations Committee, which this is formed off this committee and becomes the name for all of this science, never has a building in the UK. It's never allowed to create an institute. Its institute exists only in ships, and those ships exist only in the Southern Ocean, or supposed to be in the Southern Ocean. They start by buying the ship in the bottom left, and I've put lots of ships in because I think Effie's here. So bottom left is Discovery, which is the ship that takes Scott and Shackleton. from the golden age, so-called, of Antarctic exploration. It's found to be quite obsolete. It's been used after Scotland and Shackleton had finished with it by the Hudson Bay Company, which are fur trappers in Canada. Yeah, they still exist in the 20th century. They still exist today in a different form. They had basically not spent any money on maintenance. So the British government had to refit this ship and send it down, and then it was very unsuitable. So they bought the William Scoresby, which is the biggest ship here, which looks like a trawler because it pretty much was a trawler. It had been used in the North Atlantic whaling. The Norwegians were quite tricky. They showed the British the ship. The British agreed to pay for it. And while the Norwegians waited for the British to come and pick this up from Norway, they swapped out the relatively new engines and put in some very old antiquated steam engines, which the British only realized when they got to Gibraltar and this ship had broken down 10 times. So then the British had to basically refit this ship. It's all going well. And eventually the British decided to build a custom-built oceanographic research ship, which is Discovery 2, which is top left. Discovery 2 is the link between this era of oceanography that me and Katie are trying to resurrect. It's oceanography based on real world needs, and the age of oceanography after the Second World War, because Discovery is used as Britain's main oceanographic research ship until 1962. So these ships have quite long careers. Those ships are fitted out with modern laboratories. This is the chemistry and biology lab. The biology lab is bigger than the chemistry lab in the interwar era. It switches around after the war. We can discuss that later. They do end up with not bricks and mortar. They end up with a building. They build a marine station in Grytviken in 1925, which they use until 1928. This is built in part because up until this point, scientists have been sent to collect specimens directly off those flensing docks that I showed you the picture of with the blue whale on, and they discovered that whalers were not very nice people. It's funny that someone whose entire career is cutting up an animal is not the nicest people to hang around with when you're straight out of university as a young science graduate. So they build this facility which has labs and rooms so that they can separate themselves from the dirty, filthy whalers, which is not quite how they phrase it, but they're not half wrong looking at the magistrates' reports. These whalers get themselves in a lot of trouble. For example, some Russian whalers there in 1919 who had at that time just heard about the Russian Revolution and tried to cause a revolution on South Georgia, which was swiftly put down by a Royal Navy ship. So there's a lot of unrest amongst the whalers. So they build this separate place on the other side of the bay for the scientists to kind of live in. And most of the specimens in the Natural History Museum were prepared in this building and shipped back to the UK. They particularly were obsessed with taking. So the whalers were not supposed to kill pregnant whales, but they did. And so any that were pregnant, any fetuses inside were stripped out, put into very large glass jars and shipped back to London. So there are lots of basically unborn whales in the Natural History Museum that were all prepared in this room. It would have been difficult to do that in a ship at sea. So most of the whale specimens are actually taken off the flensing decks when the whales have had time to kind of rot a little bit. Anyway, so this is, you might say, Sam, you're back to talking about the land. Well, let me talk about the sea a bit. This is a map of the track of the 10 years of Discovery 2 working for the Discovery investigations. And you can see that this is where I start to challenge Klaus's argument about this being the Atlantic. The Atlantic is top left, the Pacific is bottom left, the Indian Ocean is to the right. The Discovery does do a lot in the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, but it went all the way around Antarctica more than once. It regularly went up to Australia, it regularly went up to New Zealand. And you can see that a lot of what they're doing is actually at sea rather than just on land. That is partly because by the 1930s, whaling in South Georgia had shifted to whaling at sea using factory whaling ships, which is what we know of as today as modern whaling. And that was in part caused by a tax that was designed to conserve the whales. So the British collecting tax moved the Norwegians into collecting them at sea and processing them at sea, so they didn't have to pay British taxes for processing them on British territory. Now here's the one bit of science that I wanted to gain. This is probably, if you're a physical oceanographer, the most important thing that the Discovery Investigations did. And this is me trying to just prove that they're not just doing marine biology. So this is Antarctic convergence. This answers one of the biggest problems of oceanography of the 19th century, which is, to put it simply, if you can sit in the middle of the Atlantic and you can measure a Gulf Stream that's moving at 13 meters per second from the Gulf of Mexico towards Europe, why is the Gulf of Mexico not a desert, and why is Europe not underwater? How does that water return? And they discover through the hydrographic experiments of the Discovery Investigations that there is a deep cold current that returns towards the equator that counteracts the warm surface current that comes from the equator. And that's what this diagram is showing. It shows the warmer water coming into contact with the Antarctic continental slope and pack ice cooling and dropping. And when they go up to the Arctic and do experiments, they discover that the same thing exists in the Arctic. This answers how the ocean circulation works, basically, which, funnily enough, maps what they theoretically thought, but it provides empirical evidence. Now I'm coming towards like the paper bit. So one of the things that they did was publish this as scientific report. So they published 37 volumes. These were published from 1929 onwards. The final report didn't come out until 1980, just before the Falklands War. Most of these are produced by women. The women who were employed by the Discovery Investigations were employed at pay rate of secretaries, so about a third of what the scientists got. The women employed were all PhDs. The scientists didn't have PhDs, go figure. And the women all worked at the Natural History Museum in London, and they worked with those samples that were sent back, and they wrote them up and they drew them and they put them into nice reports. These books were heavily illustrated. They were very expensively produced. They were produced by Cambridge University Press, but they were entirely paid for by the British government. So Cambridge University Press went to no lack of expense. These have lots of illustrations, pullouts. They are bound in leather. They're beautiful. And they also include, beyond marine biology and hydrography, geography. And if you want, which is partly the idea of, if you map a territory, you control and own a territory. And also it was for one major important reason, which is the distribution of these reports. These reports were distributed to every national library around the world. So not just in the British Empire, in America, across Europe, in Japan, because they would then position in every country Britain's domination of this space. They're then sent to every National Academy of Sciences around the world. They're then sent to oceanographic research institutes around the world. And by the time you've distributed to all of those places, you distribute to UK universities and UK, my screen's just died, UK oceanographic centres. Most of the print run has been bought by the government, who've also paid for the production, and it's been sent around as a political document. And you have loads of letters in the archive of UK universities like Hull and Liverpool, smaller universities, asking for copies and being told that they've all been given away already. So these are used by the government as a way of kind of positioning around the world Britain's scientific expertise in different libraries. Today, they contain probably the best record on whale biology that you're going to find anywhere, and they're still widely cited and used. But it's also about showing the creation of this empire through the popular media, popular press, both home and abroad. So they spent a lot of time planting stories in newspapers. They would provide access when any journalist asked. They would provide photographs. They would provide written articles. They would provide comments. They would revise drafts articles that were sent in. And you can see just some examples here. And I'm going to go through a few slides of examples, and then I'm going to talk about two other cool things, and I'm done, just in case you're worried about time. So on the left-hand side, you can see hidden wealth at the poles in an important Scottish newspaper. And this article explains the economic value of this scientific project, but they also offered stuff. So the next to your right is the children's newspaper, which is illustrated and with even squeamier pictures than the one I've shown you. So there was no trigger warnings in the 1920s for children. This is Country Life. Country Life is a magazine for well-to-do women who live in the countryside or farmers' wives. It usually has stories about country fairs and pig breeding, and carries adverts for landed country estates that you might go for a shoot on or that you might want to buy. It doesn't regularly carry things about whales in the southern seas, but it shows that they, you know, the breadth of what they're doing. And this is a multi-page article. It's heavily illustrated. And also there's like a local thing. So again, I've stuck this in for Effie. This is the Hull Evening News in the bottom right. And this is just a local paper in a maritime community talking about that boat, the William Scoresby, and talking about one local person who was one of the crew and saying that they had returned. So it's working at multiple levels here. It's also in a typical British style. The press pokes fun back at the discovery investigations. Excuse me, to really understand the cartoon on the left, but that's Hindenburg, the German Chancellor. I think this is against the Meteor wanting to come into coming into the Southern Territories as well. The Meteor expedition does a lot of work around what Britain was claiming. I think that's what this is too, but I've not been able to find the notes from the Discovery Committee that go along with this cartoon. But you've also got on the right here, in the middle is a Punch cartoon, which is just a funny poem. But the one on the right here is published in 1928, and this is the discovery. There's a scientist dressed almost like a wizard with the word science coming out of their hat, going straight for the whale, going, I see a whale, and the whale as a life problem. They're being made extinct, and all the whales want is some oxygen. This is a cartoon about the problem of conservation science, that it's also science in support of industry. It's quite a clever cartoon, but I don't have time to discuss it, so we'll move on. They also do stuff for popular science, more popular science magazines. Blue Peter on the left is a kids magazine for teenagers in the 1930s. This is an article about X-rays, and that the Discovery was one of the first expedition ships to have a full hospital, which will become important for what I'm getting to in a minute. And they had a portable X-ray machine. In the middle, that's a factory whaling ship, which I think is horrific. It's the worst image in here. I think that is a horrible, evil-looking thing. And that is a blue whale going up the slip. That would kill the Discovery investigations financially because the tax revenue would go down. And on the right, that is an article about echo sound location, and it's talking in the text entirely about the Discovery investigations use of this technology. There's very few in their own saved clippings from around the world, but this is one example from, I think this is Swedish or Norwegian kind of scientific kids journal on the right, and that's an entire text provided by the British. I don't know how it's translated. It's British photographs provided free and British maps. And on the left, in addition to all of these kind of press newspaper reports, scientists were encouraged to write memoirs, which then the government would cover the cost of printing. And this is the Times Literary Supplement. It's the British equivalent of the New York Review of Books. And it's a front page lead article reviewing all of these memoirs that all of these scientists have published. So it's big. They make sure that everyone knows about this, even in an age before social media. Now, coming up towards my final point, the Discovery also, and this is a big argument in the book, the introduction of permanence in terms of scientific and British government presence in the Southern Ocean is in part why nobody dies on expeditions between 1920 and 1940 in the Southern Ocean, on Antarctica. Before, in the decades before, say 1900 to 1920, lots of people died, including Scott, some of Shackleton's crew, because of exposure, because of accidents, including Shackleton himself, although that was because he was an alcoholic, but that's a different story. And they took part in a group of rescues. And I want to show you some cool clips. So this is Ellsworth, an American who tried to fly over Antarctica and couldn't get his plane back up into the air when he landed on soft snow. It's covered extensively in the press. And when they find him, the Discovery, that's Discovery 2 in that photograph in the middle, gets page-to-page coverage, and it's very clear that the British rescued the American. I've pieced this map together, but this is what Ellsworth was trying to do. He's trying to fly from the right to the left of this map. He said this was across Antarctica. It's not really across the South Pole, though, but it's a big flight in terms of the amount of Antarctic territory. And he was planning to take aerial photographs of Antarctic territory that had never been really mapped or seen. Antarctica, as you saw in that 1917 map, is just a white flat disc on the map. He wanted to show where the mountains were, etc., so that it could be potentially explored in more detail. So I want to show you 2 video clips, and then I'll finish with the final little clip. So this video, which is put out by Pathé News, and we didn't check the sound, which is my stupidity. We'll see if the sound works. If the sound doesn't work, we might have problems. But this video shows you so the video clips, the video itself got back to London before the voiceover was put on. So when the video is shot, they don't know whether Ellsworth's alive. The voiceover is done by which point in time they do know that Ellsworth's alive. And what I want you to do is compare this video with the next video with how many British flags you see, right? So in this video, it's a rescue. So does you have sound? No? No. Okay, hang on. I'll just talk over it. You're going to, no, I can't. Oh, shall I try this with the stop share? No. Let's just watch the video. I'll send you the links. Basically, there's a jolly music that's now playing in my ears. It's very triumphant and brassy. And it's basically talking, the voiceover talks about heroism, adventure, search for this American flyer. That's the captain saying it's going to be a problem, it's going to be a challenge, we'll do our best. Jolly good that we are. And I might have to just mute it for myself because I can't think while that's talking in my ear. They acquired this Australian Air Force plane. This is the Australian pilot doing a very Australian accent, going, yeah, sure, it'll be fine, no sweat. That's one example of a British flag. And off they go, right? And they're sent off from Melbourne to go and rescue the silly American who's done the silly thing. So that Pathé News clip goes around the world, searching for missing explorers, and there are a lot of them in the interwar period, from Amelia Earhart to Lincoln Ellsworth, is kind of page-to-page news. It's the equivalent of Chilean miners being trapped today or Thai football teams getting stuck in caves. It's wall-to-wall news coverage as much as wall-to-wall news coverage can be in 1930s. The second video, which unfortunately doesn't have titles, but let me mute it so that I don't have to listen to it. This is when they know he's saved. So check out here how many British flags you can see in the choice of clips they have. So this is Ellsworth looking relieved, talking about how it all went wrong. This is him with his flight, so it was from there all the way over. Yeah. Lots of pictures of ice. The ship, the little plucky British ship that comes to save him. Some of this is footage from the last shot. One British flag. So it's talking about how, without the British he'd have died, and the British were able to be there. They were quick. They fought through ferocious amounts of ice. They used the plane to spot ice. They broke through. British flag too. It's talking about the heroism again. Lots of ice. The little plane. I think there's another flag coming up in a minute. This is them poking the ice floes out the way. They walk to him. They eventually find him. His plane has been buried in the snow. He's been lost for 60 odd days. All weird landscape. They then look how big the seas are. They're ferocious. They battle back through the seas. They're back in Melbourne. Hundreds of people come to see him. There he is. And at this point, he's interviewed. That's Australian Prime Minister, and he's going, "Oh, I'm so grateful to the British and the Australian governments for saving me. Otherwise, I'd have been toast. Isn't it great?" So there's the American flag, but there's the British flag, right? So this is great propaganda for the British. They sell that news clip around the world. It's seen by millions of cinema goers, and it finally makes the no, I don't see it again. Now, to Ellsworth, this is a great success. I mean, to me, this is a great fiasco and disaster. He publishes this, and I'll send you guys the link, the DEEPMED people. He publishes this account of the whole fiasco. And these are what he was trying to do. These are the aerial photographs from his flight, which might have been able to help produce a topographical map of the interior of Antarctica. So for Ellsworth, this is a great success. You know, he didn't die. I mean, that's a low bar for success. But anyway, for the Discovery investigations, this is a whole new possible media outlet. So they go in with that newsreel company into producing a film, which has some of that reel. And this is, I mean, I'm not really managed to look at this file, but he talks here. This in the middle is the list of shots they're going to use, and they reshoot some of it. This newspaper article on the left is them filming. That is one of the scientists, John Hart, getting makeup done for reshooting some of the dramatized scenes of both what the Discovery does, but also the Ellsworth rescue. And you can see on this letter on the right, Discovery 2 must be the theme of our picture. And this must never be obscured through, although we make full use of such exciting incidents as the rescue of Ellsworth and Kenyon. And this emerges into a script. And what Discovery investigation scientists use this for, and this is when the Discovery starts to break away from industry. And I think what Katie's talking about that more pure science for science kind of definition of ocean science starts to emerge. So this is a script from the eventual film. Talks about harpoon being loaded. You see the harpoon gun to the right of the screen and it fires. You see it to the left and it fires. You see it face on and it fires straight towards the camera. The screen goes black. A white question mark explodes from the center to fill the screen. You'll have to imagine this because we've not been able to find this film. The title music has continued over these scenes to a rising climax and stops abruptly as the last gun fires. In the silence which follows the question mark, a calm voice, which I can't do, but a calm voice says, "How long can this go on without exterminating the whale?" So it's propaganda, it's anti-whaling, right? Which is not what the Discovery investigations is formed for, but by 1930 is the position of most of the scientists. And this poses lots of problems about whether the Discovery investigation should be continued, whether they really were about funding science, or whether they were about funding science that supports the industry. The Second World War intervenes before we find out what would have happened to the Discovery investigations. In the post-war period, it's broken up into a newly formed National Institution of Oceanography that's more geared towards military oceanography. For more about that story, see my earlier book. But what I wanted to pick up on as one last kind of fun anecdote to finish with you is chapter 7, and which is hidden in there as the Penguin incident. So for all of this bravado and British kind of success in its own head only at controlling this territory of the Antarctic, in 1940s the British once again send the Norwegian whaling fleet, who are now under British protection because they are the Free Norwegians, because Norway is invaded by the Nazis, back to South Georgia to continue to take whales. And in the dead of night, one evening, the German ship on the left, which is called the Penguin, which is German for penguin, which is a converted freighter, but you can see there's a gun on the back deck, captures, asleep, and I mean literally they were asleep, it was 3 o'clock in the morning, the entire Norwegian whaling fleet, factory whaling ships, whale catchers, the whole lot, puts prize crews on all of them, and sailed the whole lot back to Bordeaux in France without the Royal Navy even noticing. And the entire Norwegian whaling fleet was captured asleep. This is a massive failure in my mind of any British claim to control of this space, because they couldn't even protect the whaling fleet in times of war. And that is my final anecdote. I hope this has given you a kind of crazy introduction to some of the stuff that we're covering in the book. And I'd be interested to hear what you think about our arguments about science as a method of taking ownership of a space that is liminal, that doesn't become fixed, it's not territory. Questions around how you then show the world that you have that control, and also maybe if you've got any questions about or thoughts on our point about the creation here of a kind of stable permanence in the Southern Ocean that means that exploring Antarctica is less dangerous in the 20s and 30s than it had been in the early 1900s. So thank you. That is my non-conclusion to my paper.
Wonderful, Sam. Thanks a lot. It was very entertaining, but also very informative. I liked that your sound didn't work, because I'm sure that the videos narrated by you are much better than the original.
I cannot do that British 1920s, 30s kind of voice. I'm not the right kind of background to have it. So you'll have to have a listen. They're only short videos.
We will leave a link in the description of the videos. So we will keep your narration, because I think it's important, but we will also give people the opportunity to see the original ones. Thanks a lot. Questions to Sam in the room or online? I have a couple, but okay, can I then start with two questions which seem small but may not be? First of all, I mean, you even suggested this question yourself. It's very important to your story, this paper empire, or rather this science empire. So how do you set an empire on the sea and not on land? Through oceanography. And these parallels was what Ben Hardy and Katie Anderson have been saying about the meteor, right? How does Germany, the interwar period, when it was severed from any kind of colonizing effort, how does it build an empire? Through the meteor, so through science, through oceanography. But then at the same time, you said, well, but how effective was this empire when actually the Nazis came and seized a Norwegian whaling ship? So the question is, what do you mean by setting an empire? Is it a paper empire in the dismissive sense of the word, or is it effective in any way? What does it mean? Are you sure they were setting an empire through science, or did they say it sometimes and then forgot about it?
I mean, it's what they said, but I think empire doesn't work just through science. They're trying to basically create an industry, and some of the stuff that report in 1920 set up was geological surveys that had never been done. Unfortunately, when they did the geological surveys, they discovered there wasn't coal. So by 1925, all of the other stuff that they thought might be possible, like could you have a sustainable penguin industry, because penguins have got oil, right? In the First World War, merchant navies of Germany and Britain had been told to take any penguins that they found, or large seabirds, right, because the oil was useful. But it wasn't perceived that you could sustainably farm penguins, unsurprisingly. The seal population was an example, had never recovered. In 1820-21, there was an American expedition to take the seals, and it's estimated that they took about 200,000 seals from Antarctic islands, subantarctic islands, and that population never recovered. When they went the third year, they found hardly any seals, and when they went 100 years later, they found no seals as well. So they tried to introduce reindeer, they tried to introduce sheep, They didn't do very well. They tried to introduce horses. They didn't do very well. So they were desperately trying to find a way of creating an industry, because if you could use science technology to develop an industry, you could move this. I mean, dependency is a key word here. This was a colony that survived because it got money from the central metropole of London. So money was sent down, supplies were sent down, because it was a useful harbour in the age of sail to repair boats that had damage around Cape Horn. But it was basically a drain on the imperial treasury. So if you could make it self-sustaining, that was what they were trying to do. And they were trying to use science and technology to develop new forms of economy. They sent scientists who were pure scientists down, though. So once they'd done their surveys, they went, oh, well, you know, I'm not an entrepreneur. I'm not got any intention of developing any industry, but here's my report. And so it never quite joined up. One of the reasons we've been calling it a paper empire is because they then gathered all of this paper together, all of these reports in 1955, and submitted them as evidence to the International Court of Justice to say, look, we've been here doing stuff that's been of value to all of humanity, and we spent a lot of money, and that is why we should continue to have territorial dominion over these spaces. And the International Court of Justice, which is highly stacked towards the likes of Britain and America, kind of sides with Britain in 55, but then there's the international treaty that is the Antarctic Treaty that challenges that British dominion, right? But in reality, did they create a more habitable space? No. Did they create any new industries? No. In fact, they actually pushed whaling into the ocean and off the land, which made it harder for them to generate income. Their entire science budget was based only on that tax, right? And in the early years, that was a lot of money, and by 1927 onwards, that was a very quickly diminishing amount of money. Does that answer?
Yep, absolutely it does. Thank you very much. Effie?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Because you can't see me. Maybe you couldn't hear me either. Thank you, Sam, for this very interesting and entertaining at the same time talk. And thank you for the photos. I've seen loads of them in Hull, as you may guess. Lots of pictures of the ship leaving the Humperdinck. But did it actually leave from Hull for the discovery investigations? I'm not sure about that.
No. So I said that they had no base in the UK. That is technically true. But all of the voyages left from St. Catherine's Dock in London, which is now still there.
You did mention that. Maybe I've missed that.
But I mean, when they're talking about a media strategy, one example I left out, because it's in the chapters on the crew, there was a lot of crew problems with these voyages. And one of the most public examples is they set up a media strategy because they could see that the Colonial Office was going to cancel the expeditions in the 1930s. There was the financial crash, there was financial pressures. And so they set up there would be film crews ready at St. Catherine's Dock. They'd lined up a whole series of interviews. They were going to use the captain as one of those people to interview. This is in an age before people are given psychological assessments before they're sent south. And the captain had clearly been unwell ever since leaving South Africa. And they pulled into dock in Plymouth, and he probably should have been left in Plymouth and told to get the train. But they left with him on board, and he jumped off the ship somewhere in the English Channel. And the ship arrives into London with a huge media scrum ready for the ship to come back. And the captain has committed suicide. And that is headline news around Britain for about a week. It's not quite the media strategy that they had carefully plotted out. So,
okay.
Yeah, go on.
I think I remember reading, I think Rob Robinson has written like a short piece ship, and I think I remember that him mentioning that it actually left the Queen dog from Hull for the Antarctic investigations. But yeah, I have to.
So some of the whaling ships, left from Hull. Some of the whaling fleet, but as far as I know, the research vessels never did. They always left from London.
From London. Okay.
Yeah, because that was the closest major port, basically. And Shackleton's last expedition left from St. Catherine's Dock. So it was kind of a jumping off point for all sorts of expeditions. I mean, Hull is obviously got a long history of North Atlantic whaling. And the Norwegian whaling fleets, I mean, they're all crewed by Norwegians, even though they're British, tended to use Liverpool as a port, which I've not really got to the bottom of why Liverpool, but they certainly didn't bring smelly whaling ships into London. That would have been very much frowned upon. Hull and Liverpool, which are big fisheries ports, for those who don't know, in the UK, were the two main ports that these whaling ships return to.
Well, yeah, okay. I will look more into this. And another question before someone else, because I will forget about it. I'll take you to the beginning of your talk. Linger that much there, but could you say a little bit more about the Svalbard whaling industry? Was it like just the Dutch doing business there? When did it decline? Because
right. Good question. I mean, so the whaling industry in Svalbard or Spitsbergen, yeah. Multiple nations take part in that. Swedes, Danes, Brits. I mean, the William Scoresby, who becomes a famous kind of scientific natural philosopher figure in Britain, after his exploits as a whaler, he was whaling up around Spitsbergen, and the cruise.
He did go to Greenland too.
Yeah,
though,
so it's
right?
I mean, it's all seen as part of one big expanse of whaling, right? So it's from Greenland in the west to Spitsbergen in the east. All the space in between, they're just taking whales. There's also New Bedford whalers from America up there. The European boats tend to be crewed by Faroese, Shetlanders, Norwegians, and Icelandics. And you've got to remember that for many of the years we're talking about here, which is most of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, Norway is not an independent country, but is under Swedish or Danish rule. And so there wasn't many opportunities for Norwegians. So going to sea was a major route of escape from oppression at home by Norwegians. So by the end of the 19th century, the ships have increasingly got auxiliary steam engines. The harpoon guns are more powerful. Very quickly, the whaling industry collapses because the ship technology is such that it's easier to catch more whales. So they basically just take more, because more equals more money for the crews. So the whaling industry's largely died off by the end of the 19th century, to be closely followed by the cod fishery, the herring fishery, the haddock fishery, which a lot of the ships also partook in, and that decline is why the Dundee whaling fleet went south, right, in the 1880s to Antarctica, because they had struggled. Whitby fleets also went south, and I think some of the Dundee whaling fleet was actually Whitby and Hull whalers, not just Scottish. It all changes in 1898 and 1908 when coal is discovered and coal mines are set up. The Russians set up coal mines under the Tsarist attempt to control the Arctic. The Norwegians see this as a great opportunity. The British set up a company to look for coal. The Americans set up a company. This is all in the background of Norwegian independence. So Norway gets independence from Sweden in 1906, which I wrote about in the paper that I think the DEEPMED team have read. And Norway is absolutely adamant that it needs to be Spitsbergen needs to be Norwegian. as part of this new nation. And then there's a lot of complicated treaties negotiated. I don't think it's overstating it, although I think it would have been unlikely because they were all allies, that if the First World War hadn't been started by a bullet in Sarajevo, it could have been started by a bullet in Spitsbergen. This area is highly geopolitically sensitive and tense at the time, in the years before the First World War, because whoever controls Spitsbergen controls access into the high Arctic. And who knows what's there. If you can find coal in Spitsbergen, what else are you going to find as you get a forward base, basically, to explore higher latitudes? And that's been written about. I mean, we're not going to write a lot about that. We're just trying to tell the story as kind of, you know, South Georgia and Falklands, you could say, is a Spitsbergen of the South for the Southern Ocean for the British. If they could have found coal, it would have been able to be a place where you could have launched really deep expeditions into Antarctica, the kind of expeditions that we do get in the 1960s, but using air technology rather than ship technology. So that's, I mean, it's South Georgia where Shackleton returns from Elephant Island when he's shipwrecked. So South Georgia was already becoming a key, and it's the whalers who save Shackleton's expedition. It was already becoming, the permanence of residence there was already becoming important to prop up Antarctic exploration. So to my mind, there's a comparison between the two archipelagos of islands.
Great, thanks.
Hi Sam, can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you for the talk. It was really enjoyable. Actually, I have two related questions that are. The first is actually a clarification of this last point you made. When there's a move to the South Atlantic, is it who is going to Brit? And because you just described this competing situation in the North, does the whole thing move, or is it, how do the Brits achieve this level of sovereignty in sort of a non-violent way? Is that the case?
So who are the? So I think you're asking who are the competitors in the Southern Atlantic, and how is there not violence?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So there are competitors. There's Argentina, and there's Chile. There's also anyone who'd been up in Spitsbergen could have turned south, right? And the Germans have interests before the First World War. They have African colonies. In that long report, ironically, which I've just taken as just being colonial office nonsense, they say that Egypt and India would be interested in these expeditions. As far as I can tell, the Indians and the Egyptians saw no interest in these expeditions at all. So the British thought everyone in the world would be interested in this space. But the direct competitors are Argentina, probably, in terms of being geographically close to them. The way that the British deal with the Argentinians is to allow them to have a license through a joint company that becomes the Pesca de Argentina, and it's officered by Brits and Argentinians, but it's staffed by Argentinians. Argentina is basically the beef of Britain. When you think of Brits at the end of the 19th century as being British beef and bully beef and all this kind of, well, the Brits are eating Argentinian beef that's coming across in refrigerated ships in Buenos Aires. So Argentina and Britain and the British refer to it as the Argentine. Britain and Argentina in the late 19th century has such a close economic relationship that it would be almost inconceivable that they'd go to war over this. And one of the ways the British ensure that is to have certain concessions. So the Argentinians are allowed to create a meteorological station on these islands in the early 1910s on the proviso that they share data with the British, but no one else apart from the Norwegians, who the British have supported for their independence, and only again because British people sit on the boards of these companies, they operate under a British license system. The Norwegians are allowed in, although the Norwegians were seen as a strong ally, not a strong threat, right? So the Brits only allow 2 allies into here. Almost everyone else, they largely just don't invite in. So they just don't even suggest it. They just, this is British, right? And the way that they largely avoid violence is they don't find anything of great interest, right? The whaling fleet economic returns was really attractive in 1910 through 1914. It becomes increasingly unattractive once the post-war recovery of whale stocks starts to decline from about 1923 onwards. So by 1927-28, no one really cares about this British whaling industry that's now in decline. There's nothing else been found. There's no gold, there's no coal, there's no oil, although we found them since, but they hadn't found them then. So largely there's not a great geostrategic interest for other countries in coming into here. And actually the Arctic is more accessible. Right, having coal mines in Spitsbergen is a lot easier than having coal mines in the Falklands and dragging all of that. If you had to drag all that coal 18,000 miles back to Europe, it would become very expensive coal. Whereas if you've got resources closer, why would you go to all that trouble? So only the British Empire at the time had the stupidity, I would say, but the capacity, if I'm being less flippant, to really kind of even conceive of trying to do this. It's only the Americans after the Second World War, with all of their military technology that they've developed through the Second World War, which start to even pay much heed to Antarctica. And the Soviets really only go to Antarctica because the Americans go to Antarctica. And it just becomes an extension of Cold War, which is a totally different logic to this imperial mindset of we should extract every last ounce of economic value of every space that we possibly can. Yeah.
So do you think that this necessity to use science as a legitimation of empire, given that there's no indigenous population there, so less resistance than elsewhere, do you think this is actually only a consequence of post-World War II dynamics? That wasn't the point before? Does that make sense? The question.
Sort of. I mean, do you mean for the British or for everyone?
British.
I mean, so this is post First World War. The British, this is an argument we need to think about in the book. At the time, the British state starts to think about science as being deployed. In the First World War, Brits sent scientists to the front and they died in huge numbers, and that wasn't seen as incredibly valuable. Science and war have a strong collection of innovation. The British found that their scientific superiority wasn't very superior in the First World War, I would say. They discovered that the Germans had created synthetic alternatives to many of the natural products that Britain used, and so the naval blockade was only limited. The British just planned to blockade Germany, and that would be the end of the war. And then they discovered the Germans could make all of these things that the British were trying to deny them, whereas the British struggled against U-boats to bring them in from distant places like copper from Chile or whales from the Southern Ocean. So the British created something called the Directorate of Scientific and Industrial Research, which had someone who sat on this Discovery Investigations Committee board. And that was an attempt by the British within Britain and then within the Empire to basically invest in science and industry, closely relating the two, so that Britain could try to recover the economic and scientific advantages that it perceived that it had lost in the Second Industrial Revolution from the 1870s onwards. So it's not just that this is Imperial Britain starting to realize that it slipped behind scientifically and technologically, and the government centrally decided to invest in that, which was a huge departure from 19th century British ideas of laissez-faire economy. So the British don't directly involve themselves centrally in these kind of matters, but they did from 1920 onwards, like most European countries did. You see in the 20th century a centralization of science and state. I'm just saying this is empire. What happens after the Second World War is not specifically empire, right? America, if you ask them, American government will tell you we don't have an empire. Many academics disagree with that. And America at this time is creating an empire in the Pacific, like Katie was trying to say last time. The British Empire starts its decline in this time as well. We shouldn't know. I mean, American historians will tell you that the British Empire has been in decline since 1776. I think that is mistake, you know, that leaves out the whole scramble for Africa. But British Empire starts to decline once you have Irish Home Rule, which is Ireland breaking away from the United Kingdom, that happens in 1921. When the rest of empire sees that Ireland, which is very close, right next door to Britain, can break away, any part of the British Empire can break away and form its independent self. So this is a moment, this is a complicated way of me of saying that this is both a country, Britain, and an empire in crisis, and they reach out for anything. And I mean, in India, they use violence. There are lots of massacres in the 20s and 30s by British troops in India. And in Palestine, they use violence. But in Iraq, they use violence. In other parts of empire, they use science and technology. There is a correlation, which I'm be careful to say because this is going to be recorded, but how Britain and it treats its empire where the majority population is white, or as you said, doesn't have an indigenous population, versus where the majority are non-white in the 20s and 30s is vastly different. One is violent and one is modern and scientific, and you can work out for yourselves which one is which.
A follow-up question, Sam, if I may. You mentioned the meteor and how some cartoons might be maybe directed against the meteor. So there is some competition there, right? By the Germans in the interwar period, which were claiming also to be building an empire through science and technology, at least according to Penhausen and Anderson.
And the British denied the meteor a lot of access to ports in the Southern Ocean. So and the Germans go, okay, that's fine, because I mean, when the meteor goes, I mean, again, it's not, the sources don't say this. The Discovery 2 is the nearest vessel the British have to the meteor in terms of capabilities. It's built after the meteor, right? So when the meteor in 25 to 27 is going into the Southern Ocean, this modern heavy fuel oil ship which can last at sea for many months, the British are using the Discovery, which is predominantly sail powered and has an auxiliary steam engine and is out of date. And they're using the William Scoresby, which has knackered engines that the Norwegians have swapped out under the British noses. So, you know, all this imperial chest beating greatness that I showed you in that paper empire bit doesn't really stand up to it when you look at what's actually happening behind the scenes. The British are using very antiquated vessels. Their scientists don't even have PhDs. The German scientists largely did have PhDs. And I mean, a counter argument to what I've just said is that was made by the British at the time is the meteor is an outdated expedition. The British see the meteor as an attempt to do a Challenger, which the British had done 50 years before. And the British saw that as outmoded way of doing oceanographic research in a way. So it's not until 1950s that the British returned to a Challenger model of long distance expeditions that don't have a connection to economic kind of purposes.
Thank you. More questions? I have one. Oh, you also have
No,
one.
you go.
No,
I think mine is less relevant.
Why? Well, mine kind of is a side topic that you mentioned, that the laboratories in the ship, within the ship, were I think biology bigger than chemistry, and then it moved to chemistry larger than biology.
Yeah.
Could you say more on that, please?
Yeah, I can do. So ships are not static beasts, right? There is a big difference between when a country converts a ship to science, which is the Challenger or the Discovery or the William Scoresby, and then when it builds a ship that is for science, which is Discovery 2, Meteor, Dana, Atlantis, the US boat, right? So this boat is built for science. There is dedicated deck of science. There's dedicated space to laboratories. Those photographs are not great. There is a beautiful line drawing of the laboratories, which I couldn't find for put in the slides, done by one of the scientists, because one of the things is that the scientists are found early on to drink a lot, and so they create activities for them, including an art class. And so there's some beautiful paintings and drawings that the art class produced of the ship to stop them drinking. It didn't really stop them drinking, but so the two studies that they're doing, they're looking at the marine fauna and at the top of the tree is the charismatic megafauna, which is a fancy way of saying the whales. But they are interested when they are at sea in looking at the smallest organism, which is the thing that whales eat, which is plankton. And in 1925, Alistair Hardy, who's one of the guys who goes on this voyage, creates the continuous plankton recorder, which is still an experiment that's done today. It uses a basically very similar device to what Hardy designed in 1925, which is a device that automatically counts, because counting these marine organisms is very difficult, and you just trawl it behind you. And from that, plankton becomes a major kind of statistic of health of an ocean space, because without the plankton, the whales can't eat. And that answers other questions. I mean, it was believed by or put around by the Norwegians that the whales that you caught off the coast of Africa in the winter, southern hemisphere winter, were not the same whales that you then caught in the summer in Antarctica. So one of the things the discovery do is prove that the plankton move, so the whales move, so you are killing in winter and summer the same whales, so you're killing them twice as fast. So the marine laboratory at sea is mostly dedicated to that plankton stuff. They're also interested in what they call fisheries hydrography, which is the ICES, the ICES kind of model of looking not just at the kind of traditional natural history of these animals or marine life, but also looking at the ecosystem. So the water, is the water getting warmer, and is that meaning it can't live there, or is it getting colder and the food sources die? Or is it getting saltier or less salty? What is the geophysical properties of seawater's relationship to marine life? And I think these studies were also done extensively in the Mediterranean, but tended to be done from marine stations, right? So this is, and at the time from Challenger to about 1950, so 1870 to 1950, marine biology got more funding than physical oceanography. By 1950, physical oceanography was very much on top, but physical oceanography was kept alive during this 50-year period or 80-year period, and I can see Helen Ozdowski and Katie Anderson are going to disagree with me on this. It's kept alive through fisheries hydrography by basically being something that supports the marine ecosystem studies. In the 1950s, the Discovery 2 and the Discovery Investigations are enveloped into the National Institute of Oceanography, which combines military oceanography that's been undertaken by the Royal Navy and the Admiralty during World War II, the Discovery Investigations, and the Hydrography Office of the Royal Navy, the people who map and chart, and the scientific element of that. The Hydrography Office continues, but the scientific element doesn't. They come together as National Institute of Oceanography. Discovery 2 is given to the National Institute of Oceanography, and they refit the ship. And in refitting the ship, they change around the configuration of the laboratories. And that then reflects from the 1950s onwards that physical oceanography is now the dominant, and they get the bigger space, and marine biology becomes the smaller space. The way that it works now in modern oceanography is you'll have a laboratory kind of area on a ship, and it is reconverted for which science is going on that cruise. So you have these flexible lab spaces that can be both. Why they couldn't do that in the past, I do not understand. I think it's partly that all cruises had both on, right? Had both marine biologists and physical oceanographers on, but also I think it's egos as well. I have the biggest laboratory, means I can take the most scientists, right? We can fit 5 scientists in our lab, you can only fit 3, therefore we should always have more physical or marine biologists going on cruises. But today these lab spaces are fantastically high tech and can be switched to whatever science is being undertaken very quickly without needing to go to a full refit that refurbishes the whole ship.
Any more questions?
One question.
Yeah, please.
Thanks, Sam, for interesting story. But I have a question. I mean, I'm going further than your presentation. In your opinion, what would be the potential implication of this paper for nowadays, or maybe for another geographical area like the Mediterranean Sea?
So are you asking me what's the implications of this story for now, today? Or it's a good question, because normally I have one foot in the present and one foot in the past in all my work. I haven't really thought about it. I think at heart I'm an internationalist, and I'm against anything like this in terms of one country saying we have domain over a space. I think the Mediterranean is a good example of that. I mean, can you imagine in the last 4,000 years? Well, but let's not go there. In the last 200 years, one country saying we have dominion over all science undertaken in the Mediterranean. It would be impossible to think of that. And the Mediterranean has its own problems in terms of the Mediterranean is currently geopolitically unstable or stable, depending on which bit you're in. But if you find oil, or I think now we should be thinking lithium, if you found large stores of lithium under the seabed at an accessible depth in the Eastern Mediterranean, that would pose a whole world of problems for Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean peace and stability, as there was arguments between Turkey, Greece, and possibly Egypt, possibly Israel, possibly Lebanon about who owned that territory. If you throw into the heady mix other companies from other nations getting involved, I mean, you have a potential ticking time bomb. So we as a world need to get better at understanding how we share out resources like that are found in the sea. There's been this principle of the common heritage of humankind going back to 1966, but what that means is unclear, really, and how that might be implemented is really unclear. The other example you might use is outer space. Like the technological capabilities of certain countries is vastly outpaces other countries, and and now we have commercial entities into that game as well. So we need to be better at understanding that things like the Antarctic Treaty, which has been with us since the 1960s and has stayed largely static, is it fit for the 21st century? Will it be fit in 2100 for a very different world? So, if there's anything in my story, it's that you can't be like the British were in the interwar period. You need to take a much more internationalist approach. I think also it's very difficult to serve two masters. So it's very difficult to work for developing an industry, but also work for conservation. And we see that problem in the IPCC all the time. At a few COPs ago, it was around coal again. In India, being against winding down coal early. There's all sorts of parallels about funding models of science and whether they really serve all humans on Earth or not. So, I mean, I could talk at length about that, but this paper would just be, or this book will be a very, very small contribution to a much bigger debate that's going on about the scientific model that we have and whether it's fit for purpose in the 21st century.
Lino, can you hear me? Please, one question. Well, no, it isn't a question. It's a thing interesting for me to share with you, Sam, and with the rest of the people, because I see parallelism between this place, Antarctic Sea, with Mediterranean Sea. For example, in the In the case of William Smith, Captain William Smith, I don't know if you know, because, for example, he's a member of Royal Navy, and this person had a print, an important print in London. I can't remember in this moment. He or his son had an important print, and in this print, he could share different investigation in Mediterranean Sea related to, for example, bathymetry. I don't know, for example, climate issues, meteorological aspects in the Mediterranean Sea. Then I don't know, but I think that in this case, in the person of Captain Smith, there is a union between Royal Navy and science, but I don't know. But when I heard you parallelism, for example, in the media for describing the role of Empire science and the Empire, the British Empire and the science, when you are describing, I don't know, but I think there is parallelism with the Mediterranean Sea.
I think, yeah, I mean, there's parallels with the Mediterranean Sea. I'm just not qualified to account for them. I can talk to your point about military science and the connection here. I mean, it's mostly in the chapters that I didn't want to talk about today, but the Royal Navy said very early that it would not provide crews. This was to be merchant Navy crewed, right? Civilian crewed by, and then there would be scientists. And then very quickly they appoint, because after the First World War, there's lots of former Royal Navy men who are now out of work. They appoint some ex-Navy people who go, but we need uniforms. Because when they go to these ports, they fly the British flag, and local dignitaries want to come down and visit the ship and be hosted, right? When they go to Australia, there's the one beautiful source that they've got in Southampton is the ship's visitors book. And it has it has the King of Spain, right? It has almost everyone of royalty in Europe at some point went on this boat and signed this book at some point. And they, the entire visiting England rugby team, for example, signs this thing. And so they adopt, and you could see it in the video clips, a semi-Royal Navy uniform, a slightly elevated form of uniform from what a merchant sailors would have had to connect themselves. But one of the things that's key here, and also they do bathymetry, right? They do charting, because they are discovering territories that have never really been charted at all, and the naval or the officers do take responsibility for that, and then that information is passed back to the Hydrography Office in the Royal Navy, who do issue new charts based on survey data that comes from the discovery investigations at the time. And the discovery investigations, and it's seen as success in the 20s, is one of the reasons that the Hydrography Service in the UK, in the Royal Navy, gets massive injection of investment in the early 1930s, so just before the build up towards the Second World War, and they get a whole fleet of new hydrographic vessels. And one of which is called the Challenger, oddly, HMS Challenger. And the hydrographer to the Royal Navy during the Second World War is actually elevated to status as a fellow of the Royal Society of London. He's given scientific status. So it's not that there's not a military relationship. It's purely, the reason that I don't talk about it too much is that the Royal Navy said right from the outset that they were not prepared to offer crews for this. So the Royal Navy formally isn't there, but is informally there, in that most of the captains and the officers had served on Royal Navy vessels during the First World War. So there is, whether it's official or not, Royal Naval levels of discipline. There's certainly Royal Naval levels of drinking. And and you know, for example, they continue the Royal Navy tradition of giving everyone a free tot of rum every day, even though they're not. And they, when they arrive in foreign ports, are treated as if they are a Royal Naval vessel, and they're given that flag that's in the video. I realize the video is black and white, but the flag is a blue flag, which is the Royal Ensign, as opposed to a white flag with the Union Jack in the corner, which is the Royal Navy's flag. The blue ensign is the royal flag because it's a royal research vessel, and then it has the Discovery Investigations crest on it, so it's called a defaced ensign. So that's the flag they're given. That flag flies is a strong word. It hangs in direct sunlight in the archives in Southampton and is slowly deteriorating to dust. So if you want to see that flag that you saw in the video, you go to Southampton. It hangs on the wall in direct sunlight, so it won't be there much longer to go and look at as it UV slowly deteriorates it out of existence. But there's a naval connection for sure. I can't speak to the connection to the Mediterranean. That's your job as DEEPMED. You'll have to go and find that.
Thank you very much, Sam. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Okay. If there are no more questions, it's past time that we close this talk. So thanks a lot, Sam. We will be in touch through emails and in person with all the members of DEEPMED and whoever else wants to reach you. Thanks a lot again, and see you very soon.
Bye, everyone. Bye.